They told her to close her eyes, told her American soldiers would come in the night, that captivity meant horrors whispered, but never spoken. Greta Hartmann, 23 years old, radio operator from Berlin, stood trembling at the gates of an American prison camp in September 1945, ready to die. She had spent 3 weeks on a ship rehearsing prayers, preparing for an ending she couldn't imagine. But what waited beyond those gates wasn't an ending at all. 8:47. German women stepped off transport ships onto American soil expecting degradation. They got hot showers. They braced for starvation. They smelled fresh-baked bread. And that's when the real torture began, because the enemy broke them not with violence, but with something far more devastating. Before we go further, if you want more untold stories from history that'll leave you speechless, hit that subscribe button. These moments deserve to be remembered, and your support brings them to light. The war ended 4 months ago. Church bells rang across Europe. Soldiers embraced in city squares. But for thousands of German women who'd served the Wehrmacht, typing reports, operating switchboards, bandaging wounds, a different reckoning had just begun. Greta had been stationed at a communications post near Hamburg when the British arrived. Officers fled, men scattered. But the women? Nowhere to go. Their homes were rubble, their families scattered or dead. When British soldiers found them huddled in a bombed-out basement, nobody knew what to do with them. For weeks, concrete floors, watery soup twice daily. Then came the announcement that changed everything. They were being transferred, not to German custody, to the Americans, across the ocean, to America itself. The news spread through the makeshift barracks like wildfire. America. The word felt dangerous on their tongues. They'd been told stories for years. Brutal stories designed to steal German resolve. Now those stories would become their reality. Or so they thought. The journey began on a gray August morning. Hundreds of women, still in worn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, loaded onto trucks and driven to the port. The ship waiting for them was enormous, a converted troop transport with peeling paint and rust stains bleeding down its hull. Greta clutched her canvas bag. Everything she owned, a change of underwear, a toothbrush, a small photograph of her mother and younger brother. Both gone now. As she climbed the gangway, her legs went weak. Behind her, a girl no older than 19 sobbed. In front, an older nurse who'd served the Eastern Front stood rigid as stone, jaw clenched. The crossing took 3 weeks. The ship rolled and pitched in autumn Atlantic storms. Most women were seasick for days, barely keeping down thin broth. They slept in hammocks stacked 3 high in the cargo hold, air thick with sweat and vomit and fear. At night, in darkness broken only by dim electric bulbs, the women talked. Some prayed. Others cried. A few tried to maintain dignity, sitting upright, refusing to show weakness. Greta lay in her hammock feeling the ship rise and fall, wondering what waited on the other side of this endless water. Here's the first twist. The American guards on the ship weren't cruel. That confused the women more than hostility would have. They were professional, distant, doing a job. They brought food twice daily. They maintained order. But they didn't taunt or threaten. The women had prepared themselves for monsters. These men seemed almost bored. 10 days into the voyage, Greta stood on deck during her daily 15 minutes of fresh air. The ocean stretched steel gray and endless. A young American soldier, maybe 25, stood nearby smoking a cigarette. He glanced at her, then away. Then he did something that made Greta's world tilt sideways. He pulled out his pack and offered her a cigarette. Greta stared. This was a trick. Had to be. But the soldier just stood there, waiting. Finally, she took one. He lit it for her with a silver lighter. They stood in silence for several minutes, smoking, looking at the ocean. He said nothing. She said nothing. When her 15 minutes ended, she went below deck more confused than ever. Finally, after what felt like eternity, someone shouted that land had been sighted. Women crowded to portholes, pressing faces against dirty glass. Through morning fog, a coastline emerged. America. It looked impossibly green compared to the bombed-out gray landscape they'd left behind. As the ship entered New York Harbor, Greta caught sight of the Statue of Liberty rising from the water. She'd seen it in propaganda films, always presented as a symbol of false freedom, American hypocrisy. Now, seeing it in person, she felt nothing, just exhaustion and fear and strange numbness. The ship docked. Women gathered their belongings and formed lines on deck. September sun was warm on Greta's face, warmer than expected. She'd imagined America as cold somehow. This felt like late summer, pleasant, almost gentle. They descended the gangway single file. American soldiers lined the pier, watching. Some women kept their eyes down. Others, like Greta, looked around trying to understand this place. Here's what shook her. The buildings behind the port were intact. Tall, clean, undamaged. Not a single bombed-out shell. Not one collapsed roof. The contrast was staggering. Trucks waited. 20 or 30 women per truck, driven through the city. Greta sat near the opening, watching through the canvas flap. Streets full of cars. People walked on sidewalks carrying shopping bags. Shop windows displayed goods. Actual goods, not empty shelves. She saw a bakery with bread stacked in the window. Dozens of loaves just sitting there. Her stomach clenched with hunger and disbelief. The drive took several hours through countryside that stretched forever. Fields and forests, small towns with white churches, farms with red barns. Everything looked untouched by war. Finally, as sun began sinking toward the horizon, trucks turned onto a dirt road. In the distance, buildings surrounded by fences. Guard towers at intervals. Greta's heart began to race. This was it. The place where her suffering would truly begin. But here's where the story takes its first major turn. The camp looked nothing like she expected. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines. Buildings looked recently painted. Paths between them swept clean. American soldiers walked around casually, some smoking, some talking in groups. It looked almost like a military base, not a prison camp. An American officer, a woman in uniform, stepped forward and addressed them in heavily accented but understandable German. They would be processed, housed, assigned quarters. The tone was matter of fact, neither kind nor cruel. Just procedural. Women were divided into groups of 20 and led toward a long, low building. This is where it happens, Greta thought. This is where the humiliation begins. She'd heard stories. Terrible stories whispered in the dark on the ship. Stories that made her want to pray and vomit simultaneously. The door opened. Steam billowed out. Inside, warm and bright. Tiled walls reflected electric light. American women in white uniforms stood waiting. Medical staff. Greta's group was directed to stand in line. One by one, they were called forward. A medic checked each woman briefly. Eyes, throat, hands. Nobody was rough. Nobody made crude comments. It was clinical, efficient, almost gentle. When Greta's turn came, the medic, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, looked at her and said in broken German, "You will feel better soon." After medical checks, they were directed to another room, the housing station. Greta's heart pounded. She remembered propaganda images, degrading images designed to show how enemies treated prisoners. But what she saw made her stop in confusion. Shower stalls, real shower stalls with curtains for privacy, and on a table near the entrance, stacked neatly, bars of soap. Actual soap. White, clean, heavy bars that smelled of something floral, something that reminded her of her mother's house before the war. Each woman was handed a bar of soap, a towel, and a clean cotton gown. They were told to shower, wash thoroughly, put on the gown afterward. Their old clothes would be burned. For a moment, nobody moved. This could still be a trick. But what kind of trick? Finally, the older nurse from the ship stepped forward and took a shower stall. Others followed. Greta found herself in a small tiled space, alone for the first time in weeks. She turned on the water and nearly gasped. It was hot. Actually hot, not lukewarm, not cold. Hot water streaming from the shower head, creating clouds of steam. She stood under it for a long moment, just feeling it on her skin. Then she picked up the soap. It lathered immediately, rich and thick. She washed her hair, her face, her body, scrubbing away weeks of grime and fear and confusion. The water at her feet ran gray, then clear. Around her, she could hear others crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears mixing with shower water. The relief was overwhelming. The simple act of being clean, truly clean after so long was almost painful. It reminded them of being human. When Greta emerged from the shower wrapped in the rough but clean towel, she felt lighter. Not happy, not safe, but lighter. She dried herself and put on the cotton gown. It was simple, plain, but clean. It smelled like laundry soap and sunshine. From the processing building, they were marched across the compound to a large wooden structure. The mess hall. Even before they reached it, Greta could smell something that made her head swim. Food. Real food. Cooking food. The smell was so strong, so overwhelming, that several women stopped walking and just stood there breathing it in. Inside, long tables stretched the length of the room. At one end, a serving counter. American soldiers were already eating at some tables, but a large section was empty, waiting. Women were directed to form a line. Greta picked up a metal tray and moved down the line. Behind the counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto her tray. Potatoes. Actual boiled potatoes, yellow and steaming, green beans, carrots. And then, incredibly, a thick slice of meatloaf with dark gravy, a piece of white bread with a pat of butter, a cup of coffee. Real coffee, dark and hot. She stared at the tray. This was more food than she'd seen in months, more than she'd eaten in a week. For the past year in Germany, meals had been watery soup, black bread that tasted like sawdust, sometimes a thin slice of turnip. This was abundance beyond imagination. Greta sat at one of the long tables with other women. For a moment, nobody ate. They just looked at the food. Steam rose from plates. The smell was intoxicating. Then slowly, one woman picked up her fork, then another, then Greta. The first bite of meatloaf made her close her eyes. It was warm, seasoned. It tasted like food was supposed to taste. She chewed slowly, afraid that if she ate too fast, she'd be sick. Around her, women ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. The girl who'd cried on the ship sat across from Greta, fork halfway to her mouth, just staring at the food as though it might disappear. The bread was soft inside with a slight crust. The butter melted into it. Greta hadn't tasted butter in 2 years. She bit into the bread and had to steady herself. It was too much, too good, too impossible. Then came the thought that would haunt her. She thought of her younger brother Fritz, who'd starved to death in the last winter of the war. He'd been 9 years old. They'd buried him in the rubble of their apartment building because the cemeteries were full. Fritz had asked for bread before he died. Just bread. And there had been none. Now Greta sat in an enemy prison camp eating butter on white bread while her brother's bones lay in German ruins. The contradiction was unbearable. The guilt was crushing. She forced herself to keep eating. Her body needed it. But every bite tasted like betrayal. The woman next to her, a signals operator from Frankfurt, whispered, "My mother is starving. My mother would kill for this potato. How can this be?" Nobody had an answer. They ate in silence, mechanically, feeling food fill empty stomachs, feeling strength return to bodies, feeling the terrible weight of survival when so many they loved had not survived. After the meal, they were assigned to barracks. Each building housed about 40 women in double-stacked bunks. The barracks were simple but clean. Wood floors swept smooth, windows with actual glass, and each bunk had a mattress, not a board, a real mattress, with sheets and 2 blankets. Greta was assigned to Barracks 7, bunk 23, lower. She set her small bag on the mattress and just stood there. The last time she'd slept in a real bed was over a year ago. Since then, floors, cots, hammocks, concrete. This mattress gave slightly under her hand. The sheets were rough cotton but clean. The blankets were wool, thick and warm. The woman assigned to the bunk above her was Liesel, the older nurse who'd stood so rigid on the ship. She looked at Greta and said quietly, "I do not understand what is happening." Greta nodded. "I do not either." That night, the first night in camp, Greta lay in her bunk wrapped in wool blankets. The barrack was dark except for a single light bulb at each end. Outside she could hear American soldiers talking, their voices low and relaxed. Crickets sang in the warm September night. The air smelled of pine trees and cut grass. She closed her eyes and tried to understand. This was supposed to be hell. This was supposed to be punishment for losing the war, for serving the enemy, for everything that had happened. But she was clean. She was fed. She was warm. She was, against all expectations, still alive. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman began to pray quietly. Others joined in. Old familiar words whispered into the night. Greta listened but did not pray. She didn't know what to say. Thank you felt wrong. Please help felt meaningless. So she just lay there feeling the mattress beneath her, the blanket over her, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The morning bell rang at 6 t.o. Greta woke from deep, dreamless sleep, the first real sleep she'd had in months. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then memory flooded back. America. The camp. The enemy's prison. The women rose, dressed in simple work clothes they'd been issued, blue cotton shirts and dark pants, and filed to the wash-house. There were sinks with running water. Toothbrushes had been provided. The simple normalcy of brushing her teeth, of washing her face with clean water, of combing her hair. All of it felt surreal. Breakfast at 6:30. Oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam, orange juice, coffee. Again, more food than Greta had seen in months. She ate slowly, trying to make sense of this abundance, trying not to think about empty tables back home. After breakfast, work assignments were announced. Women were divided into groups. Some would work in the kitchen, some in the laundry. Some would do general maintenance. Others would work in fields just outside the fence, tending vegetable gardens that fed both prisoners and guards. Greta was assigned to the laundry. She spent her days washing and pressing uniforms, sheets, towels. The work was hot and repetitive, but it wasn't cruel. The American supervisor, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, spoke no German but communicated through gestures and basic words. She was neither warm nor cold, just professional. The routine settled into a pattern within days. Wake, wash, eat, work, eat, work, eat, sleep. It was monotonous, but it was predictable. And in predictability, there was strange comfort. For years, life had been chaos, uncertainty, fear of bombs and starvation and death. Here, for the first time in so long, tomorrow would be the same as today. But then came the twist that shattered everything again. The women were paid. Not much, just small wages in camp currency. But they could use it to buy things at the canteen: chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils, and paper. Small bars of soap they could keep for themselves. The idea that prisoners would be paid for their work was incomprehensible. Greta bought a small notebook and a pencil. That evening, sitting on her bunk, she began to write. Not a letter. There was nobody to send letters to. But a record. She needed to document this. Needed to remember. Someday, she thought, someone will ask what happened here. And I want to remember the truth. She wrote, September 28, 1945. I have been here 4 days. I am clean. I am fed. I am warm. I do not understand the enemy. They do not act like enemies. This frightens me more than cruelty would. Letters began arriving from Germany in October. The mail was censored, read by American staff before delivery, but it was delivered. Greta received her first letter 6 weeks after arrival. It was from a neighbor, an old woman who'd known her mother. The words were carefully chosen, knowing censors would read them, but the message was clear. Things were very bad. There was no food. Winter was coming and there was no fuel. People were living in cellars because buildings above were destroyed. Children were dying. The old were dying. Everyone was dying. Greta read the letter sitting on her bunk after dinner. Around her, other women were reading their own letters. The mood in the barrack was heavy, oppressive. One woman was crying silently. Another sat stone-faced, letter clutched in her hands. The contrast between here and there was becoming unbearable. That night, Greta couldn't eat her dinner. She looked at the plate of food, chicken and rice and carrots, and felt sick. How could she eat when her people were starving? How could she accept this comfort when those she loved were suffering? But she ate anyway, because her body demanded it, because refusing food wouldn't feed anyone in Germany, because despite everything, she wanted to live. And this realization, this selfish, desperate desire to survive, filled her with shame. The women began to gain weight. After months of starvation, regular meals were transforming them physically. Faces filled out, hair grew thick and shiny, skin cleared. They looked healthier, stronger, more alive than they had in years. And this physical transformation was its own kind of torture. To grow fat while your family starved was a special kind of hell. The American guards noticed. Some commented on it, not cruelly, just observations. "You look better. You are healthy now." The words, perhaps meant as compliments, landed like accusations. Yes, they were healthy, while their mothers, their sisters, their children wasted away in German ruins. Greta wrote in her notebook, "The food here is good. Too good. I am ashamed of every bite, but I cannot stop eating. I hate myself for this weakness. I hate the Americans for their abundance. I hate my country for its collapse. I hate everything." Despite the emotional turmoil, small moments of unexpected humanity began piercing through the numbness. They weren't grand gestures. They were tiny, almost insignificant interactions that somehow meant everything. In the laundry one afternoon, Mrs. Patterson noticed Greta's hands were chapped and raw from hot water and harsh soap. Without a word, she went to her office and returned with a small jar of hand cream. She handed it to Greta, gestured at her hands, and said, "For you." Greta stared at the jar. It was such a small thing. But in that moment, it felt like everything. Someone had noticed her pain. Someone had cared enough to help. The enemy had shown her a kindness that her own leaders never had. She took the jar, her eyes burning with tears, and whispered, "Danke." Mrs. Patterson nodded and walked away. Another time, a young American guard, barely 20, was making his rounds at night when he heard Liesel crying in her bunk. He stopped, awkward, uncertain. Then he pulled a Hershey's chocolate bar from his pocket and set it on the edge of her bunk. "I am sorry," he said in broken German, "for your sadness." And he walked away before she could respond. These small gestures didn't erase the larger realities, didn't solve anything, didn't bring back the dead or rebuild the destroyed. But they complicated things, made it harder to hate, made it impossible to see the Americans as simply the enemy. They were people. Complicated, contradictory human people. Some of the women tried to maintain their resistance, their loyalty to the fallen Reich. They refused to smile at guards. They worked slowly, resentfully. They whispered among themselves that all this kindness was a lie, a trick, a trap. But their arguments grew weaker with each passing week, because the trap never sprung. The lie never revealed itself. The kindness just continued. Greta found herself learning English words. Simple words at first. "Thank you. Good morning. Water, please." The Americans seemed pleased when she tried. They spoke slowly, helped her with pronunciation. It felt like betrayal of everything she'd been taught. But it also felt necessary, like survival. By November, 3 months into captivity, Greta was caught in a war that had nothing to do with guns or nations. This war was inside her, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Every day the conflict grew sharper, more painful, more impossible to ignore. She'd been raised to believe certain things, that Germany was superior, that the Führer was right, that enemies were subhuman, that suffering was noble and sacrifice the highest virtue. These beliefs had shaped her entire young life. They'd sent her to type reports for the Wehrmacht. They'd convinced her she was serving something larger, something important. But here in this American prison camp, every one of those beliefs was being challenged. Not with arguments, not with propaganda, with reality. The Americans weren't subhuman. They were just people. Often kind people. The superiority she'd been promised had left her starving in ruins, while the enemy lived in abundance. The sacrifice had been for nothing. Greta wrote in her notebook, "I do not know who I am anymore. The girl who believed is dead. But what replaces her? If everything I was taught was lies, then what is true? And if I accept these new truths, what does that make me? A traitor? A survivor? Or just someone too weak to hold on to what she believed?" The guilt was crushing. Guilt for eating while others starved. Guilt for feeling grateful for her clean bed and hot showers. Guilt for learning English. Guilt for not hating the Americans more. Guilt for surviving when so many had not. The weight of it made her feel like she was drowning. Some nights she lay awake thinking about her brother Fritz. He'd believed so deeply. Even as he starved, even in those final terrible days, he'd believed the Fuhrer would save them, that victory would come, that their suffering meant something. He'd died believing that lie, and Greta, alive and fed in an enemy camp, knew it had all been a lie. Was it better to die believing or to live knowing the truth? She didn't know. She had no answer. The barracks at night became a place of whispered debates. Not loud arguments, those would attract attention from guards, but intense, quiet conversations about what everything meant. The women were all struggling with the same questions, all feeling the same contradictions tear at them. Some tried to cling to old beliefs. A woman named Hilda, who'd been a telephone operator in Berlin, insisted all this kindness was a trick. "They want to break us," she hissed. "They want us to forget who we are. This is psychological warfare. We must resist." But others, like Liesel the nurse, were beginning to accept a harder truth. She'd seen things on the Eastern Front that had already shaken her faith. Now, in America, those doubts crystallized into certainty. "We were wrong," she said quietly one night. "About everything. About them. About ourselves. About what we were fighting for." The younger women were perhaps the most conflicted. They'd been children when the war started. They'd known nothing but Nazi education, Nazi propaganda, Nazi rule. Their entire understanding of the world had been shaped by that system. To reject it now was to reject their entire childhood, their entire foundation. Greta found herself somewhere in the middle. She could no longer believe the old lies, but accepting the new reality felt like betrayal. So she existed in painful limbo, neither here nor there, unable to go back, but afraid to move forward. One evening in late November, as first snow began to fall outside, a woman named Anna, a former nurse's aide, said something that silenced the entire barrack. "If what we were told about the Americans was lies," she said slowly, "then what else were we lied to about? The trains, the camps, the people who disappeared?" Nobody answered, because they all knew the answer. They'd all heard whispers, seen things, been told not to ask questions, and now, sitting in an American camp where they were treated with unexpected humanity, the terrible possibility emerged that everything they'd been told was inverted, that the real monsters had been on their own side. That realization was almost unbearable. It meant their entire country had been built on lies and cruelty. It meant they'd served evil, however unwittingly. It meant their suffering, and the suffering of everyone they loved, had been for nothing. Worse than nothing. For something terrible. In December, the American camp administrator arranged for the women to watch a film. They were herded into a large room with a movie screen. The guards told them they were going to see something important. Something about the war. Most expected propaganda. American justifications for their victory. What they saw instead was footage from the concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen. Dachau. The liberation. The piles of bodies. The walking skeletons. The gas chambers. All of it documented by Allied soldiers, clear and undeniable. Some women closed their eyes. Some vomited. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Greta watched, forcing herself to look, feeling something inside her shatter completely. She'd known on some level. Everyone had known something, but knowing and seeing were different things, and seeing made it real in a way that could never be unknown. After the film, nobody spoke. They filed back to their barracks in silence. That night, the whispered conversations didn't happen. There was nothing to say. The truth was too large, too terrible, too final. Greta lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. She thought about the soap she'd been given, the hot showers, the food, the blankets. The Americans had shown her dignity. Even though she'd served the regime that committed those atrocities, they'd treated her as human, even though her side had treated others as subhuman. The contradiction was staggering. The power of it took her breath away. The Americans could have been cruel. They had every right to be cruel. They'd liberated those camps. They'd seen what had been done. And yet they chose mercy. Not because the German women deserved it, but because mercy was who they chose to be. That realization broke something in Greta, broke it and rebuilt it. She understood now why the kindness had been so painful. It was because kindness demanded recognition of shared humanity. Cruelty allowed for distance, for otherness. But kindness said, "You are human. I am human. We are the same." And if they were the same, then the differences she'd been taught to believe in were lies. She wrote in her notebook that night, her hand shaking. "The enemy has defeated me, not with violence, but with soap and bread and mercy. They have shown me what my own people never did. They have treated me with the dignity that my leaders denied to others. And I will carry this shame forever. But I will also carry this truth, that the measure of a people is not in their strength, but in their mercy. And by that measure, we failed. Utterly and completely, we failed." Christmas came to the camp in ways none of the women expected. The Americans decorated a tree in the mess hall. They prepared a special meal. They even arranged for a chaplain to conduct services for those who wanted them. The generosity was almost cruel in its kindness. On Christmas morning, each woman was given a small package. Inside, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and a small book of poetry in German. Greta held the package in her hands and felt something break inside her completely. They had thought of them. The enemy had thought of German women prisoners and given them gifts on Christmas. The absurdity of it, the impossible kindness of it, was overwhelming. That afternoon, Greta walked alone to the fence at the far edge of camp. Snow covered the ground. The winter sun was weak and pale. She stood there looking out at the American countryside, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about who she'd been a year ago. A girl who believed, who typed reports without question, who thought she was serving something noble. That girl was gone. Killed not by bullets or bombs, but by kindness and truth. Who was she now? A traitor who'd accepted enemy mercy? A survivor who chose life over loyalty? A woman who finally saw the truth? She didn't know. Maybe she was all of those things. Maybe none of them. Maybe she was just someone trying to understand how the world could be so completely different from what she'd been taught. Liesel came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a long time. Two women who'd lost everything and found something they never expected. Finally, Liesel spoke. "I will never forget this," she said. "What they did to us here. Not the imprisonment, that was expected. But the mercy, the simple human mercy. I will carry it with me forever." Greta nodded. The irony was unbearable. They'd survived the war. They'd survived the collapse of their country. They'd survived captivity. But they might not survive this kindness. Because kindness demanded change, demanded growth, demanded that they become something new. And that transformation was more painful than any physical suffering could ever be. That night, Greta made a decision. She would stop fighting, stop resisting, stop trying to cling to who she had been. That person was gone. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe she needed to die so someone new could be born. Someone who understood that the world was more complicated than she'd ever imagined. someone who knew that mercy was more powerful than hatred. She wrote in her notebook, "Today I let go. Not of my past, not of my people, not of my losses. Those are part of me forever. But I let go of the lies, of the hatred, of the belief that we were superior and they were less. I let go because holding on was killing me. And I choose to live. Even if living means shame. Even if it means acknowledging I was wrong. I choose to live and to learn and to remember. And maybe that is enough." In February 1946, 5 months after their arrival, the announcement came. The women would be sent home. Back to Germany. Back to the ruins. Repatriation would begin in spring. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some women wept with relief. Home. Finally home. But others, like Greta, felt only dread. What home? What was waiting for them there? And how could they return, healthy and fed, to people who were starving? How could they explain what had happened to them? That the enemy had shown them more mercy than their own leaders? Greta's fear wasn't of the journey. It was of what came after. How do you go back to a place that no longer exists? How do you explain to people who are suffering that you survived, not just survived, but lived better as a prisoner than they did as free people? The shame of it was overwhelming. The weeks before departure were strange. The women had adapted to life in camp. It had become familiar. Safe, even. The routine was comforting. The food was reliable. The guards were, if not friends, at least familiar faces. Leaving all of that to return to chaos and destruction felt terrifying. Some women, Greta noticed, had changed completely. They spoke English now. They laughed with guards. They'd let go of their old identities and embrace this new reality. Others remained bitter, angry, convinced all of this had been a trick designed to break them. They would return to Germany and try to forget this place ever existed. Greta was somewhere in between. She had changed, yes, but she had not forgotten, could not forget, would not forget. This experience had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. The question was whether she could carry it home with her, or whether it would crush her under its weight. They left the camp in late April. The same trucks that had brought them now carried them away. The women, wearing new clothes provided by the Americans, carrying small bags of possessions, looked healthier than they had in years. Their faces were full. Their hair was clean and shiny. They looked like they'd been cared for. Because they had been. The journey back across the Atlantic was easier than the journey there. Spring storms were milder. The food was still good. But there was no relief this time. Only growing dread as the ship carried them closer to a homeland that existed now only in memory. They landed in Hamburg in May 1946. The city was destroyed beyond recognition. Where buildings had stood were piles of rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. People moved like ghosts through the ruins, thin and gray and broken. Greta stood on the dock, looking at what remained of her country, and felt the full weight of what she carried. She was healthy. She was alive. She had been cared for while her people suffered. The guilt was crushing. She made her way through the city, asking after people she'd known. Most were dead. Some had fled east. A few remained, barely surviving in cellars of destroyed buildings. Finally, she found the neighbor who'd written to her, the old woman who'd known her mother. The woman looked at Greta, at her healthy face and clean clothes, and something flickered in her eyes. Not quite judgment, not quite resentment, but something. "You were in America?" she asked. "Yes," Greta said. "I was a prisoner." The woman nodded slowly. "You look well," she said. And Greta heard everything that was not said. "You look well while we starved. You were fed while we died." Greta had no defense, no explanation that would make sense. So she just nodded and asked about finding work, finding a place to stay, trying to rebuild a life in this destroyed land. Years passed. Germany rebuilt slowly, painfully. Greta found work, married a man who'd lost everything in the war, had children. She built a new life, but she never forgot the camp. Never forgot the kindness that had broken her more completely than cruelty ever could. She kept her notebook hidden in a drawer. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and read what she'd written. The words of a young woman trying to understand an impossible situation, trying to reconcile enemy and friend, cruelty and mercy, hatred and kindness. Her children grew up in a different Germany. They learned about the war in school, learned about the atrocities, learned shame that Greta knew all too well. But they also learned about democracy, about human rights, about treating others with dignity. And Greta wondered if maybe, just maybe, some small part of that came from people like her. People who'd learned the hard way that mercy was stronger than hatred. When her daughter was 16, she asked Greta about the war. What was it like? What did you do? Greta had avoided these questions for years. But looking at her daughter's face, seeing the genuine curiosity, the desire to understand, she decided it was time. They sat at the kitchen table, and Greta told her. About the radio post, about the surrender, about the ship crossing the Atlantic, about the fear. And then, carefully, she told her about the camp, about the soap, about the hot showers, about the food, about the small kindnesses that had undone her completely. Her daughter listened in silence. When Greta finished, the girl asked, "Were they good to you because they were good people, or because they were following rules?" Greta thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "I do not know. Maybe both. Maybe it does not matter. What matters is that they could have been cruel, and they chose not to be. They had every reason to hate us, and they chose mercy instead." "Why does that matter?" her daughter asked. "Because," Greta said slowly, "it means that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose kindness. It means that mercy is not weakness, it is strength. And it means that maybe, just maybe, we can learn to be better than we were." She pulled out her notebook and showed her daughter the final entry, written in 1946 just before she left the camp. It said, "I will never forget the soap, the simple white bar that smelled of flowers. It was just soap, but it was also proof. Proof that the world is not what we were taught. Proof that enemies can be human. Proof that mercy exists even in the darkest places. And proof that sometimes the hardest thing to accept is not cruelty, but kindness. Because kindness demands that we change. And change is the most painful thing of all." And so the soap became more than hygiene. It became a symbol, a memory, a lesson that Greta carried for the rest of her life. For those 847 German women who passed through American prison camps in 1945 and 1946, the experience of unexpected mercy became a defining moment. Not because it erased what had happened, not because it made everything right, but because it showed them that the world was more complicated than propaganda had taught them. They had been told to close their eyes, to expect horrors, to prepare for the worst. What came next shocked them more deeply than cruelty ever could. Because what came next was simple humanity. Hot showers, clean clothes, regular meals, small kindnesses. And these things, these simple, basic human dignities, dismantled their worldview more effectively than any propaganda could have. The story of these women is not a happy story. Many never fully recovered from the guilt of being cared for while their families starved. Many struggled for years with the contradictions they'd experienced. The trauma of war mixed with the trauma of unexpected mercy, creating a complicated pain that had no easy resolution. But it is also a story about the power of choosing mercy over vengeance. The Americans who ran those camps could have been cruel. They had every justification. They'd seen the concentration camps. They knew what had been done. But they chose to follow the Geneva Convention. They chose to treat their prisoners as human beings. Not because those prisoners deserved it, but because that is who they chose to be. And that choice mattered. It changed lives. It changed perspectives. It planted seeds that would grow in unexpected ways in the decades to come. Some of those women became advocates for reconciliation. Some raised children who worked to build a better, more democratic Germany. Some simply carried the lesson quietly, letting it shape how they treated others. The soap that Greta was given on her first day in camp was just soap. But it was also a message that said, You are human, and you will be treated as such. Even though you served the enemy, even though your country committed atrocities, even though we have every reason to hate you, you are still human, and that matters. That message, delivered not through words, but through actions, through soap and hot water and bread and blankets, changed Greta's life. It didn't erase her guilt. It didn't bring back her brother or her mother. It didn't rebuild her destroyed country. But it gave her something to hold on to. Proof that mercy existed. That people could choose kindness even when they had every right to choose cruelty. As Greta told her daughter decades later, her voice quiet with memory, they gave us what our own leaders never did. Not freedom, not victory, not glory, but dignity. Simple, human dignity. And I learned that dignity, when you least expect it, when you perhaps do not deserve it, can break you and remake you. It can show you that the world is bigger than your small hatreds and your narrow beliefs. It can teach you that mercy is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. That is the story worth remembering. Not just the history of what happened, but the lesson it teaches us about humanity, about mercy, about the power of simple kindness to change hearts and minds. These women expected cruelty and found compassion. They expected vengeance and found mercy. And that unexpected mercy did what violence never could. It opened their eyes. If this story moved you, if these forgotten chapters of history matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. These stories deserve to be told. These lessons deserve to be learned. And your support ensures we can continue bringing these important, often overlooked perspectives from World War II to light. Thank you for watching, and for remembering.